Hello, I'm Alison Williams, Managing Editor at HR Advance. Do you ever wonder about whether workers are legally responsible for work health and safety too, or is it always the employer's responsibility? Do employers have to do anything to make sure their workers know about their duties? Maybe do certain workers have more duties than others? What about supervisors, for example? Then there are others who may be in the workplace: customers, clients, couriers, contractors, subcontractors, or their employees. And then there's visitors, even trespassers. Where do you stand with health and safety when these people are in your workplace? And what penalties will apply if workers breach any health and safety duties that they might have? Today, I have with me Alan Girl, a lawyer and work health and safety specialist with Australian Business Lawyers and Advisors, and he will be giving some simple and clear explanations of these and other questions relating to employers and workers' responsibilities for health and safety. Welcome, Alan.
Thank you. Welcome, Alison.
All right, first up, can you tell me a little about yourself and your work in this area?
Alison, I've worked in this area for most of my professional life. I started my career within the government, and I was a prosecutor for the Queensland government, mostly prosecuting occupational health and safety matters. And since then I've moved within government and then externally of government. From about 2005, I've represented companies in responding to actions brought by various different governments.
So you've been on both sides of the equation.
Absolutely have.
Okay. All right. Well, Alan, I know you've got some slides with you, so if you could start taking us through what are the statutory obligations of employers, officers and employees.
I think in order to understand the obligations of employees, we really need to put it in context. And probably the first thing to do is to talk about what's happening across the country in terms of harmonization. So in most states in Australia, they have adopted a model act, which is the Work Health and Safety Act of 2011, and in fact New Zealand has followed us as well, so they have very similar legislation. Western Australia and Victoria have not adopted the model legislation, but their safety legislation is still very similar to the model legislation. We've now, since 2011, we've seen a bit of a shift, and we're now starting to see Queensland de-harmonise from the model legislation, but I might talk about that a bit later on. Under the model legislation, the obligations of various different parties are addressed. So the primary duty of care really applies to businesses and companies. We talk about a person conducting a business or undertaking, but in most cases that is going to be a corporate entity or maybe a sole trader or a partnership. And the primary duty of care for a business is to ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, the health and safety of workers and others. And that's the obligation that you see applied most often when you're looking at the work health and safety legislation.
Okay, yep. I've heard of PCBU, so that's what we're talking about here, yeah? Mm-hmm.
And within a business, there will be officers, and those officers have an obligation to ensure that the business complies with its obligations under the Work Health and Safety legislation, and the officers demonstrate that they have taken the appropriate measures to make sure that the company or the business complies with its obligations by demonstrating that they've exercised due diligence, which is a defined phrase under the legislation. So if you were an officer of a company, then you would be very focused upon what your due diligence obligations are. We then get down to workers. Now, workers do have obligations under the Work Health and Safety legislation. And on this slide we can see it's just summarised, but they have an obligation to take reasonable care for their own safety, their own health and safety, and the health and safety of others. And that includes cooperating with any reasonable instruction, policy or procedure. So for workers, we don't often see government regulators taking action against workers, but it does happen, and when it does happen, it tends to be a very serious matter. What we do see a lot of is businesses calling upon their workers and holding them to account to make sure that they comply with their obligations under the Work Health and Safety Act. Lastly, on this slide, we see that other people who come onto business premises, they have obligations as well, and they must take reasonable care for their own health and safety and the health and safety of others, and also cooperate with the actions of others for the purposes of achieving work health and safety. Now, when you're talking about others, that could be all sorts of people. That could be clients, strangers. It could be someone simply wandering off the street getting instructions on where they need to go. It could be contractors, could be all sorts of people. And they have obligations and duties to care for themselves and not to create a situation where other people will be placed at risk.
Okay. So when you mentioned that somebody who's coming in off the street, are you saying that they have an obligation to care for their own safety too, or it's more the employer needs to be aware of them?
So everyone has an obligation. An employer has an obligation, and their obligation is to ensure the safety of basically everyone that's on the site. But that doesn't excuse workers and other people from looking after their own safety. It's a cooperative scheme.
Yeah, okay, good.
We've just flipped onto the slide for the primary duty of care under the Work Health and Safety Act. And most people will know this, and it's useful to put up this slide just to understand what that primary duty is. So for a person conducting a business or undertaking, and in most cases you could simply substitute for those words a business must ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, the health and safety of workers engaged or caused to be engaged by the person, and workers whose activities are influenced by the person while the workers are at work in the business or undertaking. So you can see there that it's a big net that's cast. It's designed to capture everyone that's working at the workplace. And the key words in that slide are the words "so far as is reasonably practicable," and those words are defined under the legislation. And we can see now on the slide a summary of that definition. So a business has an obligation to ensure the safety of people on that work site so far as is reasonably practicable. And that means they have to take into account the likelihood of hazards occurring, the degree of harm that could follow, what the person ought reasonably know about the hazard and risk, and what ways there are to eliminate that risk. And lastly, of course, the cost of eliminating or minimising the risk. So it's not an absolute obligation, but businesses have to take a sensible and balanced approach to their duty of care.
Okay. I suppose when I think of that, I look at that, I think of, once upon a time, a local construction site, say somebody was having a house built, that would be unfenced. Anyone could wander onto the site. Nowadays, that's all very tightly controlled. So it's businesses looking at the fact that somebody could get in there and
that's absolutely right. And we've seen over the last 20, 30 years an enormous change in expectations of industry. So you've highlighted one there, which is putting fencing up around the site. That's a normal expectation of most businesses now. And maybe 30 years ago that wouldn't be such a normal expectation. All right, let's have a look. We've got a case study here, which is a really interesting case study. It's a penalty that was imposed in Victoria on a company, Toll Transport Proprietary Limited. And I think it's a great case study in terms of learning from what occurred on this case. So in this case, Toll Transport was operating a vessel, and onto that vessel they were taking containers. And you can see in the top left-hand corner of this slide a picture of a loader and a trailer that is used to carry the containers onto the vessel. Now, if you imagine that that trailer, or the loader and the trailer, are going from left to right, and you'd see that the operator of the loader down in the bottom left-hand corner of that picture would not be able to see an awful lot when the crates are in front of him or her, but in this case him. And as they imagine that that trailer was coming from the jetty, being pushed up onto this vessel, so it goes up a ramp, and as it goes up over the ramp and onto the vessel, the visibility for the operator of the loader is very poor. Then once the loader gets up over the hump and gets onto the deck of the vessel, there is the risk that there will be a worker on the deck of that vessel and that they might be impacted by that trailer. And unfortunately that's exactly what happened, and we can see one of the workers there in the bottom left of this slide, who's unfortunately no longer with us. Now there was no malice in this. It was all completely unintended. But what happened was, Toll Transport identified that they had a hazard and that there was a risk of people being hurt, but they failed to put into place proper systems for managing that hazard and risk, and as a consequence someone was killed. The courts looked at that, identified that there was an offence had occurred, and considered what would be an appropriate penalty, and in this case $1 million fine was imposed, which is not the largest fine that we've seen for occupational health and safety matters, but it is a very large fine. And I think the lesson for us is, if we identify hazards and risks, it's really important that we address them and that we make sure that we put in place adequate systems for managing those hazards and risks. The next slide that you have is the duties of officers. And keep in mind that the obligation of an officer is to make sure that the PCBU complies with the Act. So in most cases that will be an officer, it might be a general manager, or it could be a director or a CEO, has to ensure that, say for example, a company complies with the Act.
Can I just ask, there is a supervisor considered to be an officer?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and in some cases a supervisor might be an officer. In most cases you would think that you would have to be a bit more senior than a supervisor to become an officer. The definition of officer is the same definition as exists under corporations law. Mm-hmm. So the Work Health and Safety Act picks up that definition out of the Corporations Act and applies it. And that definition requires that the person has influence over a substantial part of the business. So when you say a supervisor, if it's a low-level supervisor who doesn't have a substantial influence over the entirety of the business, or a large portion of the business, then they probably wouldn't be an officer. But if it was a smaller business where a supervisor might have a lot of influence over the conduct of the business as a whole, then there's a chance that they are an officer. It's always worth spending some time thinking about who are the officers and who are not the officers.
Okay.
Now, as I've indicated before, the way in which we measure whether or not an officer has met their obligations in ensuring that the, in most cases, company has complied with the company's duties and obligations, or the primary duty, is by looking at whether or not they've exercised due diligence. And that phrase, due diligence, is defined. And there's a real trap here which a lot of officers fall into. If you look on the slide, you can see there's a number of criteria there that an officer has to meet. And you'll see at the end of each bullet point there is the word and I've capitalised it to emphasise it. I think maybe on the next slide I've emphasised it even further. And a very, very easy trap for an officer to fall into is to fail to do something on just one of these bullet points. And if they fail to do something on just one of these bullet points, then there would be a case to argue that they haven't exercised due diligence. I'll give you an example.
Okay.
Imagine you had a company who had a former Olympian as one of its directors, to help guide the board and give the board some ideas from the perspective of someone who's trained very hard and achieved great results. Now that director might fail to go out and walk the site because they're not really interested in how factories operate and the way in which power presses operate and things like that. So it would be very easy for that director to fail to satisfy all the bullet points on this screen. So if you look at the second bullet point, gain an understanding of the nature of the operations. A really good way to gain an understanding of the nature of operations is actually to walk around the business and talk to people. Pretty simple, pretty easy to do. It would be a terrible shame if you didn't do it, and when it counted, you weren't able to show that you'd exercised due diligence.
Okay, that's a very interesting point. Thanks, Alan. I imagine there's quite a few companies that might have directors who, just, they've come from different walks of life.
Yep. Yeah. Or they might just be very busy and it's hard to set aside that time to do those things that are important. All right. Now we're getting down to the important point for this presentation, which is the duties of workers, and you can see there the whole of section 28, which we summarised before, and you can see that a worker must take reasonable care for their own health and safety. And that's really important. From an employer's perspective, often we see workers doing things, sometimes for well-intentioned things, but very silly things, where they end up being hurt. So, for example, they might take a shortcut across an area where forklifts are operating and might end up being hit by a forklift, or they might see something in the machinery and think that they can quickly whisk their hand in and grab it and pull it out. Or they want to produce a better result for their employer, so they rush a job, and as a result of rushing the job, they end up making a mistake and getting hurt. Now, no employer wants that, and part of the purpose of this section is to say a worker has to stop and think about their own health and safety and make sure they're taking reasonable care for their own health and safety. If we go to the next slide, you can see some words highlighted in this section. And this is often important when employers are not looking to government regulators to enforce the section, but are looking at what they can insist upon when they're dealing with their own employees. So they can insist that their own employees, so far as the worker is reasonably able, to comply with any reasonable instruction, and they can insist that workers cooperate with any reasonable policy or procedure. Now, this is stronger than an employer giving a direction, and it's stronger because if the worker doesn't do this, then they're committing a criminal offence. And if they're committing a criminal offence, then the employer is much better positioned to take whatever management action they need to take in relation to that worker. It's also not the employer's rules, this is the government's rules, so it's not open to debate. This is a fixed rule that workers must comply with.
Would you say that most employees know that they might be committing a criminal offence if they take that shortcut?
They probably don't, and I think it's very useful to have a conversation about the obligations, sometimes to get in an external person to convey what the obligations are in a matter-of-fact way, not in a way that's sort of accusing or threatening, but just saying this is what the law is, this is what you must do. If you don't do this, you're breaking the law and you might be committing a criminal offence.
Yeah.
The next slide is an absolutely fascinating case. It's a case from Queensland, and it's a case about where a low-level supervisor committed an offence. The picture is a picture of a bridge in a suburb called Ripley, which is west of Brisbane, Queensland. And in this case, what happened was that bridge was constructed in about 1980, and when they constructed the bridge, they poured cement into a framework, and the panels within the framework were made of asbestos sheeting. And when the cement set, the panels bonded with the cement, and the external skin of those horizontal panels that you can see had asbestos sheeting bonded to them. So you had a core of concrete with a skin of the sheeting. Now, a truck was driving along this road, hit that bridge, and damaged the bridge. So it was necessary for the bridge to be repaired. What's another interesting twist in this case is that the bridge was owned by the Queensland Government. The maintenance was done by the Queensland Government. Everything in this case involves the Queensland Government in terms of obligations and liabilities. But put that aside for the moment. The bridge had been built, it had been damaged, it needed to be repaired. A government repair crew came in. They did have some private sector contractors assisting, and they started to repair the bridge. Now, in order to repair the bridge, they had to take off that asbestos sheeting, which meant cutting the sheeting, grinding the sheeting, chiselling the sheeting, and pulling it all off. At the time, they didn't know it was asbestos. And to put the best possible case for the site supervisor, he thought that because the bridge was constructed in 1980, it was late enough that asbestos sheeting would not have been used. But he didn't actually check. Mm-hmm. Some of the workers were pretty cluey on asbestos, and they got fragments of the asbestos, and they took it to the supervisor and said, "We think this is asbestos. We want you to check it." And the supervisor took a bag of asbestos off them and undertook to have the asbestos sheeting tested. Now, the workers were very concerned because of the amount of dust they were producing about the possibility of asbestos, and every day they would go back to the supervisor and say, "Have you had that asbestos? Have you had those fragments tested yet?" Anyway, the supervisor ended up saying, "Yes, I have had the fragments tested, and there was no asbestos." It was a complete lie. He had not done anything to have the sheeting tested. So they kept on working. The workers still felt uncomfortable because they thought that the sheeting looked like asbestos. And the supervisor went on leave. And whilst the supervisor was on leave, the workers took the sheeting to the acting supervisor and said, "We think this is asbestos, can you get it tested?" So the acting supervisor had the sheeting tested, and then within 24 hours they knew that it was asbestos sheeting.
So it only took 24 hours
to check.
Yeah.
And then after that everything blew up. Now, as a result of that incident, the supervisor was criminally charged. The Queensland Government didn't financially support him as far as I can tell, and he had to engage his own lawyers, which would have been costly, to represent him, and he ended up being convicted and fined. He received if my memory serves me correctly, he received a fine of $20,000. The Department of Transport and Main Roads was also prosecuted, and if my memory serves me correctly, it got a fine of I think $170,000. Very interesting case. It's one of the few cases on where a worker has been charged and convicted. Right. Now, penalties. This is one of the areas where we're deharmonising, and the most common maximum penalty across the country is in the vicinity of $3 million. But Western Australia, I see at the moment, is pushing up its penalties, and it should, in the near future, go up to $3.5 million. Okay. And Queensland has introduced a new industrial manslaughter offence, which I'll talk about a bit later, and it's gone up to $10 million. In terms of jail sentences, Western Australia is at the moment increasing its jail sentences, and it will come up to 5 years. Australia has other states have been at 5 years for a little while, and Queensland, with its industrial manslaughter offence, is going up to 20 years jail.
Wow, 20 years.
20 years. And you can see there that if the opportunity arises, courts can be quite creative in the way that they deal with people who have been found to have breached the Act and composed a wide range of different orders. In order for those other orders to work, there normally has to be cooperation between the prosecution and the defence for that to come into place. Queensland is really breaking away from the harmonisation model. Do you think I should talk a bit about what's happening with Queensland?
I would like to know what's happening with Queensland, because maybe it's going to have an impact on other states, and obviously it's important for those of our subscribers and others who are located in Queensland.
So for Queensland, prior to harmonisation, Queensland had work health and safety officers. It was part of the legislation, and then during the harmonisation process, Queensland argued for the rest of the country to take on work health and safety officers, and that didn't happen. And under the harmonisation model, there are no work health and safety officers. Just for those people who don't operate in Queensland, I'll explain what a work health and safety officer is. So under the harmonised legislation, you have health and safety representatives. They're elected officials. They're elected by the workers, and they represent the workers in that elected capacity to try and improve safety on the workplace. A work health and safety officer is a person who's appointed by the employer. They normally have good qualifications, and they, as the employer's representative, they try to improve safety on the site. Now, in practice, the reason why they were very popular was because they acted as a bit of a bridge between the management and the workers in terms of joining the two and allowing there to be productive discussion and good improvements from a safety perspective.
So just to be clear, were they employed only to be a work health and safety officer? Yes. It wasn't on top of other duties?
No. Not normally. And and one of the big attractions from an employer's perspective is because they appoint the work health and safety officer, it's someone that they have chosen, and it's someone that they have confidence in, and it often means that it's someone that they will take into their confidence. So this concept of a work health and safety officer tends to be more workable than an elected health and safety representative. That's why they were very popular in Queensland. Queensland lost them when the new harmonised legislation was brought in, but now Queensland's gone back to where it was prior to the harmonised legislation. And they've done that by introducing an evidentiary provision. And under the evidentiary provision in Queensland, if you have a work health and safety officer, it acts as evidence that you're in compliance with the legislation. But if you don't have a work health and safety officer, then that acts as evidence that you're not in compliance with the legislation. So a lot of Queensland employers will be rushing out and recruiting work health and safety officers.
Okay.
Just in Queensland, I think the thing that's probably most topical is the introduction of industrial manslaughter. But before we go to that, I think it's useful to talk about some of the cases where manslaughter charges were brought. One of the very topical ones in Queensland is a case at the Eagle Farm racecourse. So it was a horse racecourse. And what you can see there is a pit that was dug to create a sullage tank, or a bit like a septic tank. So what would happen is wash off from stables would go into that pit. It would separate out into liquid matter and more solid matter, and then they would send the liquid matter to sewer, and the solid matter would eventually go to landfill. To create that tank, they used concrete panels which were lowered into the ground. Now, on one unfortunate day, there were 2 workers down in that pit, and you can see a crane there. It was lowering down those concrete panels, and unfortunately the concrete panels overbalanced and fell on top of the workers and killed them. Now, the person that was in charge of that operation, standing right there watching it, was a fellow by the name of D'Alessandro, and Mr. D'Alessandro has been charged with manslaughter in Queensland. The matter's still before the court. It hasn't been resolved, so we don't know whether or not he'll be convicted, but it's very topical because a normal manslaughter charge has been used in that case. If we go to South Australia, you've got a picture there of Peter Colbert. Peter Colbert ran a trucking business, and he had a fleet of trucks. He failed to maintain the brakes on the trucks, and as a result of failing to maintain the brakes on his fleet of trucks, he got charged with manslaughter. So normal conventional manslaughter. He fought that case very hard, but he was still convicted in the end, and he received a 12-year jail sentence. So manslaughter in the normal criminal law works in an industrial setting, which then begs the question of why introduce industrial manslaughter in Queensland? What is the Queensland government trying to achieve there? And, sorry, that's my fault. So, for industrial manslaughter, it's a different concept to manslaughter. It's different because it imputes the actions of workers to the business. So, if a business is operating and the workers offend against this section, then the business might be deemed to be liable for the actions of the workers. I could go into much more detail, but it's really only applicable in Queensland. I think we're probably getting close to time. We've got one last question, which is, when do you call your lawyer? This is a question that's very pressing for most people because lawyers are expensive. That's the bottom line. And so when do you want to incur that expense? And really, it's a decision, a risk-based decision. And I like to use this bridge to explain it. If you're the sort of person that is happy to go across rapid rivers, across a flimsy bridge like that, then you might be happy not to use a lawyer. But if a lawyer's standing right there, you might be happy to have the lawyer take you across the bridge and show to you which planks are rotten and which planks are weak and how's the best way to traverse that bridge. It's exactly the same with lawyers. You have to think about what risk are you willing to take, how likely is it that the government will take action against you, and then make a decision about, is it better to have someone guide you through that process and help you get a better result, or are you game enough to go it on your own?
Okay, well, I think we might leave it there, Alan. I think good advice in everything that you've told us there today. If you've got any questions for Alan on this issue of work health and safety, there's so many questions which I've got myself, Alan, so I'm sure listeners do too. So do contact us at customerservice@hradvance.com.au. Thank you for joining us and have a nice day. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you.